So before we get to the list, I want us to kind of lay out some definitions because different people interpret the spiritual gifts differently. And so there are some who look at some of the gifts and say, hey, these no longer exist. And there are some who say, hey, these are still valid gifts. And so before we kind of dive into the list, I just kind of want us to kind of set some big picture definitions on how the gifts work or what God does with some of these different gifts. Now, let me just say this before we jump in. Spiritual gifts are not a primary theological stance. What I mean by that is there are some things, we've talked about this, there are some spiritual truths, biblical truths, theological truths that we hold tight-fisted. Who God is, the gospel, so the person and nature of God, who Jesus is, how Jesus provides salvation. Those are things that we say, you know what, the Bible is clear on these things. This is not up for interpretation, and we hold these tight-fisted. It means we're not budging on these things. There's other things that are secondary or third or fourth when you're kind of looking on the list of importance. And there are things that we might disagree on as Christians that just because you have a different view when it comes to certain spiritual gifts, it doesn't mean that you get to say to someone else who differs from you to say, hey, you're not a Christian because we don't believe on spiritual gifts. Depending on the gift, depending on how strongly you view it, maybe it dictates where you go to church or not, but it does not dictate who is a Christian or who is not. So I just wanted to lay that out there as kind of this is not a line in the sand belief. This is not salvation. This is not who God is. And so within being a Christians, there can be differing views on some of these things. And so let's just kind of look at those views because they really revolve around what are typically called the miracle gifts. So because there's, by my count, 19 gifts, some people view a little bit more, some people maybe a little bit less, but because there are 19 spiritual gifts, a lot of times, just for understanding and just to kind of help us organize things, people like to group them into different groups. And so this morning, we're going to group them into the miracle gifts, the speaking gifts, and the serving gifts. And so when it comes to the miracle gifts, that's where there is some disagreement. There's basically two camps or two sides to the argument. You have cessationists, which basically say, hey, the miracle gifts stopped with the apostles. So the apostles could perform miracles and do things, but once they all died out, the miracle gifts ceased. The other group is called continuationists, and they believe, hey, every gift listed in the Bible is still active today. A lot of times we'll call continuationists charismatic churches. They believe in the continuation of these gifts. Now, I want us to take just a moment to kind of dive in a little bit to the idea of cessationism, and here's why. One, continuationism is easy to define. The gifts just keep going. That's the definition. For cessationism, I want us to understand why some believe that the gifts have ceased, partly so we can understand the argument, and partly because that's the direction I lean. So as the pastor, I want you to understand why I believe that certain gifts have ceased where other gifts have not. So first, let me give my definition of cessationism, which we're going to call cessationism light. It's not as hardcore or full force as some. Let me just define this for us. Cessationism is the belief that while God can still empower believers with miracle gifts, it is by no means the normal way God works where Scripture and the church are prevalent. So let me just say this. This is not a question of whether God still does miracles or not. God still does miracles. This is a question of, does God give Christians miracle gifts to perform healings or different miracles or speaking in tongues? So it's not, does God do miracles? That's not the question that we're asking now. It's, does God still give these miracle gifts to believers? So I'm going to give you two reasons why I think the gifts have ceased. Then I'll give you an example or an illustration of where they could still be used. And then we'll start looking at the actual gifts. So first, miracles were never the normal way that God worked in Scripture. Now, I know what you might be thinking. You might automatically be going to some, I was raised in church and I learned all of these stories of all of these different miracles that happen in the Bible, and it makes it seem like miracles were just commonplace during the time of the Bible. And while there are some one-off stories here or there, like Samson, most miracles in the Bible happen in groups in 4 different time periods. The first is during the time of the Exodus. So in the Exodus, you have a 40 to 50 year time span where you have Moses, he goes to Pharaoh, he performs all of these signs before Pharaoh. You have the 10 plagues, you have the splitting of the Red Sea, you have the time where they're wandering in the wilderness where you've got the manna and the water from the rock, and you've got ground splitting up and swallowing those who are fighting against Moses. Over about 40 or 50 year span, you have roughly probably 20 to 25 miracles happen during that time. Second time period is during Elijah and Elisha. Elijah and Elisha prophesied to the nation of Israel kind of towards the end of them being a nation before Assyria came in and conquered them. Elijah ministers or prophesies for about 20 years. Elisha for about 60 years. Elijah does 8 recorded miracles in the Bible. Elisha prayed and asked God to give him a double blessing, so he does 16. And so over the span of about 80 years, probably 70 to 80 years, you have, what's 8 plus 16? 24 miracles happen in those 8 decades. Third time period is Jesus. Now, depending on how you count them, most people will say that Jesus performed anywhere from 37 to 40 miracles during his 3.5-year ministry on earth. Now, in fairness, John tells us that all of his miracles and all of the works that he did could not even be recorded. So whatever we have recorded with Jesus, we know that there's a lot more that Jesus did. And so Jesus is kind of the outlier that in a very short period of time, he performed just a ton of miracles. But Jesus was also the Son of God. He was not a person gifted with certain miracle gifts. He was God in the flesh. So it's an outlier on a lot of